Good morning, everybody. My name is Justin Fleming. I'm a freshman here at Tacoma Falls College. I'm a biblical studies major, and I have a great opportunity of being y'all's room attendant and introducing Mr. Hunter Coates. He's going to be talking about Is the Soul Immortal, and is from Georgia College. Okay, I hand it over to you.
Hey everyone, I'm going to be discussing Is the Soul Immortal and Annihilationism and Conditional Immortality. So let me give my sort of introductory statement, and then I'll kind of flip it to slides that will kind of pace me along, and you guys can follow along as I'm talking. One of the most common philosophical arguments in favor of eschatological annihilationism is that immortality is solely guaranteed on one's faith in Christ rather than being guaranteed to all people. The thesis of this argument strikes against both dominant positions in eschatology, universalism and infernalism. Both doctrines hold that the non-saved and the saved have immortal souls. Universalism believes that all people will eventually be saved, and therefore all people must have an immortal soul. Infernalism believes that all people will not be saved, but those that are not saved will still have an immortal soul. Annihilationism turns this common assumption on its head to say that immortality is conditionally guaranteed. There are two forms of annihilationism that I will be discussing and engaging with. The first is a punitive form of annihilationism. This argues that God destroys the soul for the unsaved. If one holds to a non-punitive form of annihilationism, they will argue that the soul simply ceases to exist after a certain point in time, after the person's death. Either way, the same conclusion obtains. Those who do not accept Christ will not be immortal, and hence will stop existing at some point in time. In this paper, I'm going to examine several arguments in favor of the soul's immortality, and conclude there are both plausible philosophical reasons to think the soul is immortal, and there are plausible reasons from the history of Christian tradition to think the soul is immortal. I'm going to begin discussing Soren Kierkegaard, and then I'll go from there. Here's the argument. In Sickness unto Death, Soren Kierkegaard innovates upon an ancient Socratic argument for why the soul is indestructible/immortal. He writes, Socrates demonstrated the immortality of the soul from the fact that sickness of the soul cannot consume it as sickness of the body consumes the body. He concludes, thus, the eternal in a person can be demonstrated by the fact that despair cannot consume his self. That precisely this is the torment of contradiction and despair, end quote. So I formalized the original argument because, that's not very formal argument. So I say, 1, if the natural evil of a thing cannot destroy it, this means the thing is indestructible/immortal. 2, the natural evil of the soul is vice and wickedness. 3, if vice and wickedness cannot destroy the soul, then the soul is indestructible/immortal. 4, vice and wickedness cannot destroy the soul. Thus, the soul is indestructible/immortal. So this is going to be the argument that I will be engaging with for part of this paper. But first, I'll make a few notes on this argument. So Kierkegaard's explanation definitely differs a bit from this formalization. I like to say that he baptized the Socratic argument by giving it a Christian vein. Sin can only ruin the soul for Kierkegaard, but it cannot make it cease to exist. Indeed, the non-punitive annihilationist, the one who argues that sin eventually destroys the soul, must contend with this argument. The soul cannot cease to exist if vice and wickedness cannot destroy the soul. While this may require engagement from the non-punitive annihilationist, the punitive annihilationist can skirt by easily, because in the end, it is God who destroys the soul, not the soul itself due to a deterioration over time. But regardless of which position one holds, Kierkegaard's argument does not have many legs to stand on. In a sense, it simply begs the question. He assumes that sin cannot destroy the soul and then proceeds from that assumption. Before I explain why I think that his argument does have legs to stand on, I will first examine some possible responses to the immortality of the soul from an annihilationist. In Hell and Divine Goodness, written in 2017 from the annihilationist James S. Spiegel, he mentions a contemporary argument for the immortality of the soul from the universalist Mark Mickleo Harrison. This argument has a few particularities that must be mentioned before we can examine the premises. I gave the premises here, but we'll return to them in a second. 1. Harrison disagrees with the common assumption that humans are owned by God. Instead, he appeals to what he refers to as structural values. These include beauty, justice, etc. He goes on to say that since beauty, justice, etc. are not per se owned by God, he views our relation to God as humans in a similar light. 2. He assumes a libertarian view of free will. This is the position that one's action is free if and only if there are no alternative choices that can be reasonably made by the agent in that moment. His conclusion is that God would never destroy human beings because they are such structural values. God's destruction of even a single human being is paramount to his destruction of any other structural value, like beauty and justice. So here are the premises of his master argument, as he says. P1, all other things being equal, if an event interferes with a human's freedom, the event is metaphysically bad. P2, an event leading to the permanent cessation of a human is an event that interferes with the human's freedom. C1, therefore, an event leading to the permanent cessation of a human is metaphysically bad. P3, some metaphysically bad events would undermine the divine nature were they to occur. P4, it is impossible for events to occur that would undermine the divine nature. P5, the permanent cessation of a human is a metaphysically bad event that undermines the divine nature. C2, therefore, the permanent cessation of a human is impossible. The argument is clearly valid, but if sound, the argument entails that all humans are immortal. Whether some are eternally being tortured or all are enjoying a blissful life is outside the scope of the argument, which is to say that the argument is not in favor of infernalism or universalism. It is simply an argument for the immortality of the soul. Spiegel draws 3 issues with this argument. 2 of them are a repeat, and then 1 of them will not be a repeat. 1, it assumes that anti-biblical stance that God does not own humans. 2, it assumes libertarian free will. 3, it assumes that, quote, the permanent cessation of a human is a metaphysically bad event that undermines the divine nature. I take it that the first assumption is certainly not warranted. If we are truly made in the image of God, then obviously God owns us in some sense. Sure, there is still a sense of communal relation implied here, as in we're not chattel slaves to God, but his ownership all over us is still all-encompassing. For just one example from Scripture, Paul in Romans 9 compares humans to pots of clay being shaped by a potter. This statement is the basis of Paul's hypothesis that he then pursues from Romans 9 to 11. The hypothesis sort of worked out in a very Socratic manner, engaging with different arguments, and then Paul comes to his conclusion is, did God create some to be irredeemable vessels of wrath and others to be everlasting vessels of mercy? Paul concludes at the end of Romans 11 that the answer is no. God did not create some to remain vessels of wrath forever. He created all to eventually receive mercy. This is indicated in Romans 11:32 with Paul's statement that, quote, God is bound everybody to disobedience so that he may have mercy on them all. However, even with this does not absolve the idea that God is still likened to the potter. He must not show mercy on all people, but he does, according to Paul. The second assumption, that is, libertarian free will, if Spiegel is believed, which I think he is, may be an issue for those who deny the doctrine. I will return to libertarian free will in a moment. The third assumption seems to be where Spiegel really puts his stake in the ground. This engages with P5, as I note here. He says that even if we grant the reasoning about structural values, this does not entail that these values cannot be overridden, as in the case where ensuring divine justice would lead to the annihilation of wicked human beings. He goes on to say, quote, if human wickedness is itself a horrible offense against God, then wouldn't the persistence of rebellion for all eternity, let's see.
Wiggle the plug. Maybe it needs to be. There.
Thanks. Then wouldn't the persistence of rebellion for all I'll start over the sentence. So Spiegel goes on to say, if human wickedness is itself a horrible offense against God, then wouldn't the persistence of rebellion for all eternity undermine the divine nature? This leads him to suggest that persistence of rebellion can only be stopped in two different ways. One, the non-saved are annihilated, his argument, or two, the non-saved are saved. He then spends the rest of the chapter explaining why he thinks the issues with universalism should deter us from accepting the doctrine. Putting that aside, can Harrison's argument itself be saved? I think it can with some tweaks. I shall examine two here, adjusting P1 and P2, and then leave the rest to the discretion of the audience. P1 must be changed in some way to exclude the entailment of libertarian free will. Suppose we tentatively rephrase this as follows. All other things being equal or ceteris paribus, if an event interferes with a human's transcendental orientation towards desiring God, the event is metaphysically bad. So what I mean, I'll break down each of these words I use. So a transcendental orientation means that before all engagement in action, a human is going to desire God, but whether or not they end up following God's word can be adjusted depending on the action they engage in. But this is to say that there is a presupposition before all action that humans have a desire to follow God. So every action is either engaging in desiring God, orientating yourself towards that, or rebelling against that natural orientation that is in the nature of all humans to accept. So if an event interferes with this orientation, the event is metaphysically bad. So I say that this employs a more ancient view of free will that you find in many early church fathers influenced by Plato and Plotinus. I'm not going to entirely defend this here because I've done so in other mediums, but this view of free will dodges the issues with the libertarian model because it permits extenuating circumstances to one's life experience. For just one example, for instance, if I grow up in a home with one parent or two parent, it is empirically known that I will have a much greater likelihood of dropping out of high school if I have one parent, falling into a crime-ridden life if I have one parent. So this is just one example in a very empirical sense how libertarian free will cannot account for complete the practical freedom that we actually experience in our lives shaped by our life experiences. Two, this view emphasizes the belief that all humans are made in God's image. As Genesis 1:26 says, and thus we have an archetype that our action is consistently aimed at whether or not we accept this. This goes back to my point about the transcendental orientation. If anyone has engaged with presuppositionalist apologetics, you know this idea of transcendental presuppositions that underlie our engagement with the world. And I explained what that is, but I'll give another explanation to run over that. So again, when we engage in actions, we always have a desire towards God. That desire can either be repelled against, but that desire still remains in our nature. We're just rebelling against our nature at that point. So that is to say that because we are images of an archetype, we are images, dado, of an archetype. Images are always consistently aimed at trying to imitate that archetype. And if we are not consistently aimed at trying to imitate God, then we aren't really images in any meaningful sense of the word. Which is to say that, again, this is why we have to take a different view than the libertarian model. So, yeah, I'll put that aside. So, P2, reworking that, I wrote, an event leading to the permanent cessation of a human is an event that interferes with the human's transcendental orientation towards desiring God. This gets back to that transcendental presupposition underlying our engagement with the world. Now, to explain why I think this is justified, is that the destruction of the soul removes the soul's transcendental orientation towards desiring God, obviously because the soul can no longer act. When the soul no longer exists, it can no longer act, therefore the soul can no longer desire God, because it's no longer in existence. So, if the soul can no longer desire God, since it's no longer in existence, then freedom for the soul is impossible by the nature of the soul not existing anymore. And I think the rest of the syllogism remains valid with these changes. And again, I do not have enough time to engage in each, proposition of the syllogism, unfortunately. So, with that out of the way, Returning to Kierkegaard is fruitful here. To repeat Kierkegaard's thesis that I said at the beginning, sin cannot destroy the soul. This argument was applied to non-punitive annihilationism and found to require a response from the opponent. It was then applied to punitive annihilationism and found to be irrelevant to what the position argues. Again, non-punitive annihilationism is that the soul will eventually destroy itself over time. Punitive annihilationism is that God will eventually destroy the soul. Paul Griffiths, in a 2007 paper, may give us reason to doubt that this argument is truly, that this argument can respond to non-punitive annihilationism. He gives what's known as an Augustinian argument that since sin is the orientation towards non-being, accepting the privation view of evil, that evil is non-being, the soul's embracement of stains will eventually lead it to self-annihilation. This is why, for Paul Griffiths, contrary to infernalism, the wicked soul cannot endure perpetual torture. This is why, according to Griffiths, contrary to universalism, the wicked soul cannot endure perpetual bliss. He quotes Augustine. I have the quote here, and then I rewrite it in more formal language. So, Augustine says, "And so, the soul turns away from God and slips and slides into what is less and less, which the soul imagines to be more and more. Neither itself nor anything else suffices for the soul, as it moves away from God who alone suffices. In its destitution and difficulty, the soul becomes excessively intent upon its own actions and upon the disquieting delights it gets from them." So I rewrite this. 1, sin is an orientation of the will against God. 2, God is the source of all being. 3, since sin is an orientation of the will against God, and God is the source of all being, a continued orientation towards sin will eventually lead to non-existence. So, I draw several issues with this argument. The first and most obvious issue in my view is that so many people, accept the privation view of evil. I would even go so far to say that it is the most accepted view of evil in the Christian tradition, but so few have been led to the conclusion of annihilationism both historically and contemporary. I don't bring this up in a fallacious manner as an argument ad populum. I bring this up to say that to suggest that this is a logical entailment of the privation view of evil is simply odd. Even Augustine, who is thought to be the first Christian to argue the privation view of evil, clearly was not an annihilationist. Griffiths knows that referring to this as an Augustinian argument does not entail that Augustine would have accepted this argument, but he still seems to think that the destruction of the soul is a logical entailment of the privation view of evil. And I am simply puzzled. Why is this an entailment of the view at all? Suppose, for instance, there is a person in hell. The person remains in hell because of their continued rejection of God that extends into the next life. They continue to sin against God and thus orient themselves towards non-being. Still, how does this eventually lead the person to stop existing? I struggle to see how an orientation towards non-being will eventually lead the person to cease to exist. He seems to engage in an utter leap of logic that does not provide any justification as to how he reaches this conclusion. So that's my response. I think that the Lutheran Universalists, John Cronin and Eric Wrighton, in a joint 2020 essay, respond to Griffiths in a really fruitful manner. They write, I quote, "We think the annihilationist must concede that God could design rational creatures such that they lack the power to put their souls out of existence. By my lights, this strikes to the core of Griffiths and any other non-punitive annihilationist argument. If God does not destroy the soul, but rather the soul destroys itself, then why should we not just reject that this is metaphysically possible? In other words, the response to the annihilationists on this point can simply consist of denying that a soul can cease to exist if God is not the agent who destroys the soul. Hence, God may very well have created rational creatures without the ability to self-annihilate. I think there are several reasons to take this argument seriously. First, if God is the most good parent, it seems odd for God to create sons and daughters who could very well choose to cease to exist at some point. Sure, perhaps he would allow them to choose eternal torment over blissful union with him because of their free will. He doesn't want to violate that. But the possibility that they could just choose to exist altogether strikes me as odd. This is a more intuitive point, but this is a more scriptural point. Second, if God truly desires salvation for all, as 1 Timothy 2:4 explicitly says, it seems that if the non-saved cease to exist at some point, then God's desire for all to be saved is snuffed out by nature. That is to say, one cannot be saved if they cease to exist, but one can be saved if they continue existing. This does not entail that all people will be saved, but it does entail that this is not completely out of the question, all else equal, or ceteris paribus. That is to say, if certain people are destroyed and no longer exist, then God's desire for all people to be saved is by definition snuffed out. This explicitly contradicts Scripture. Third, if God created humans with free will, the self-annihilation of a soul would entail a complete loss of freedom. A complete loss of freedom seems to be far from what a God who gave creatures free will would intend for. These reasons are certainly debatable, but they and others lead me to believe that God probably did not create humans with the intention that some would cease to exist at a certain point. Thus, I conclude, Griffith's argument does not provide strong enough reason to doubt the ancient Socratic argument employed by Kierkegaard. To repeat, one can be philosophically justified to contend against the argument that sin can destroy the soul, because this seems to go against what God would permit to be in the metaphysical capabilities of humans. I'm going to give a final critique to this argument. This is not a philosophical critique, but it's sort of a historical overview of what early Christians thought about the immortality of the soul. So I'm going to begin with a current catechism. The only catechism that I could find from a Christian tradition that explicitly outlined the immortality of the soul was the Roman Catholic one. It says, the soul does not perish when separated from the body at death, and it will be reunited with the body at the final resurrection. So in at least Roman Catholicism, it seems that the soul is immortal and does not perish. Now, even though none of us have any reason to accept this, I still think that it's worth looking at what view that early Christians took on the immortality of the soul. So I give a couple of views here. Justin Martyr explicitly identifies the immortality of the soul as one of the great truths in Greek philosophy. Justin Martyr was writing around 135 to 140. We're talking a little over 100 years after the death of Christ. Clement of Alexandria explicitly uses the fact that the fires of hell correct and purge evil in the soul rather than destroy it as a case for why the soul is immortal. He then goes on to make a universalist argument that all people will be saved because of this, but that is beyond our scope here. He was writing around like 170 maybe. John Chrysostom, writing in the 4th century, mid-4th century, draws a symmetry between reason and immortality to say that just as God gave man reason, he gave man immortality. Now, while the Eastern Fathers do not employ the philosophical language with the same exactitude that contemporary proponents for the soul's immortality harp on, it seems clear that the Fathers thought the question of the soul's immortality was simply not up for discussion. So I give some other unlisted patristic witnesses here. Theophilus of Antioch, he was writing around 150. Melito of Sardis, around 140. Athenagoras of Athens, 170. Tertullian, maybe early 3rd century. Origen of Alexandria, early 3rd century. Gregory of Nyssa, mid-4th century. Augustine of Hippo, mid-4th century. Ambrose of Milan, mid-4th century. Gregory of Nazianzen, mid-4th century. Basil the Great, late 4th century. Cyril of Jerusalem, early 5th century. So, some more witnesses. I think that some annihilationists, like the late Edward Fudge, who I respect but strongly disagree with, often turn towards quote mining the writings of Irenaeus of Lyon and Athanasius of Alexandria, two pretty early Christian fathers. This is a very irresponsible way to engage with these figures and defies almost all scholarship on their eschatology. According to the consensus of scholars, Irenaeus very likely is an infernalist. He believes that some people will not be saved and those people will endure perpetual torture. The latter, Athanasius of Alexandria, was either likely a universalist or an infernalist as well. This is just the consensus of scholars who work on these positions. So I think that Fudge and other people who pay attention to the fathers in the annihilationist camp are right that at least some early Christians didn't believe in the soul's immortality. But according to Tertullian, these were often known as heretics. He explicitly names out 3 people who he says didn't believe in the soul's immortality, and then goes on to say that, well, the church says these people are heretics. Now, whether or not we should care about who Tertullian called a heretic is beyond my discussion here. But the point is that it is clear that some early Christians did not believe in the immortality of the soul, but they were not looked on very nicely by the Nicene Fathers, the ones who accepted the Nicene dogma of the Trinity and other important dogmas that shape Christianity today. In conclusion, I argue that annihilationism struggles not only philosophically, but has little basis in the early church. Again, these who were the first people to actually read the Bible and engage with the Bible and compile the Bible. There seems to be a reasonable philosophical case in favor of humans having an immortal soul. And I think that a response to the question of an immortal soul should at least in part be based on what has been understood in the earliest of Christian tradition. Thank you all for attending this conference, and I await any questions that you may have.